Hello and welcome to this review of the TV show The Alienist that recently came out on Netflix. Now before I get into spoiler territory with a full in-depth review, if you're wanting to know if you should spend some time and watch this show or not, I'll offer some advice. So I do recommend this show for any fan of a historical period drama and a crime/horror genre. But I have a disclaimer to add. The Alienist can be graphic and deals with some really dark evil events and some society issues. So it's not just a visual horror, it's very detailed in how life would have been like for the lower classes, especially around children. I have seen some other reviewers mention this was hard to stomach. A good gauge would be if you've watched the Netflix Mindhunter TV show and enjoyed that. Put that show back 100 years to the late 1800s, and that's probably a pretty good comparison. Okay, so moving on to spoiler territory. So I was really hooked on the show. I almost skipped Westworld to complete the show. Interesting enough as well, this TV show was released in America in January of this year, but I believe Netflix snapped it up as soon as it came out, so that's why we've got it a couple of months delayed. Okay, so onto the story here. So the bunch of characters as a group that we're introduced to at the start, they really don't work at all. Whilst we're clear what the main story of the show is, to solve the crime, to catch the killer, as the show progresses, it almost breaks down into really investigation into these characters themselves. So the show is far more invested in detailing out the story of each character, whilst in the background kind of trudging along with the main plot. Whilst that does sound a little bit negative, the characters themselves are really intriguing, and how they exist as well within the society of that era. I will just quickly recap on the 6 main characters as well and their backstory, and just what they've kind of overcome to get to where they are and what they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So characters, let's start with the main one. So let's start with Laszlo. So he has major father issues, obviously. He has that abuse which caused his deformity. He also has a death of a child which he is blamed for, and he blames himself as well, so he's got a heavy guilt around that. And that, I believe, is one of his main drivers to solving this case here. He also declares his love to Mary, only to have her die, which is a real stab in the back for him. What I find as well really amusing with Laszlo though, many times I've shouted at the screen, calling him an arsehole, I hate you, but also in the same vein, feeling very sorry for the character. It was an interesting emotional roller coaster watching that character. And moving on to John Moore. So obviously he's an alcoholic. He's also been betrayed by his wife, so he has that kind of weighing on him, but in addition, he has really confused emotions about how he feels about Sarah. So there's an interesting component there, how he seems to be battling that, but also trying to move forward. In the end, we see he does succeed in that, but it's an interesting story. Okay, now let's move on to Sarah Howard herself. So the story of her father, which we believed to be suicide initially, but then we find out later that it was actually she assisted him, which was a pretty traumatic story. So she deals with a lot day to day. Being a female in a position of power, the sexism she gets at work, and a never-ending battle she fights to be a part of the investigation, so she's constantly fighting for justification. Moving on to the Isaacson Brothers. So we see Marcus Isaacson. Obviously, he finds that girl and finds out she has a baby. He's torn up about that. He doesn't know how to proceed, but in the end, he does figure out he doesn't care. He loves her. But we also see the Isaacson Brothers dealing with that racism throughout the whole show, and really trying to find their place within society as well. So that's another interesting roller coaster for the show. Now, the last one I'll mention is Theodore Roosevelt. So just him dealing with the corrupt police force and the corrupt politicians. So once again, all these characters seem to be battling constantly for their place in the society, their place in this role in the investigation. So it's just constant for them. I will also mention that all these characters for me I thought did a really fantastic job. Often I find a few characters or a few actors may struggle in roles like this, but all of them seem to really nail it for me. So whilst we are getting our minds all around those situations, we have the main plot as well. So we have the main plot and we have the general society issues, so the populace dealing with all the same issues that they are. So on to the investigation. Now the investigation is very interesting. At every turn, the team are faced with brick walls, and once again, that's society issues. People struggling to grasp concepts which they're presenting to them, refusing to accept advances in medicine, advances in technology, dismissing psychology. Again, the story just seems to struggle. It's advancing and really trying to capture the killer there. Whilst I say the investigation did struggle a bit with the brick walls that they faced, they did some amazing things. So some of the stakeouts I thought were really cool, using their characters as bait there. Very stressful and intense moments. Also, the killer himself really seemed to gain an almost supernatural air. Almost a demonic aura he had. They really built him up to be a very evil entity. It was very powerful. Perhaps one of the biggest characters as well I haven't mentioned yet is the actual city of New York and how much it was changing. The sets are amazing. The different locations, whilst they were delivering a message of hope in the background, making the bridge, making these big buildings, future hope and future prospects, it was still so very dark and depressing. Visually, the show was stunning, but also very gritty and real. Audio was also very powerful. It was a really emotional track. It was quite nice. So in summary, I did really enjoy the show. It was definitely that emotional roller coaster which you really kind of want. But I did find myself getting slightly annoyed a few times. So a few of the story arcs or story events really just seemed to drop off and not get explored. So I guess one example would be the episode where we saw John Moore. He was drugged and supposedly abused. When the episode finished, I was freaking out. I was like, oh no, what did they do to him? And just to find out next episode, it just kind of casually gets brushed away. Also, another example would be the killing of Willem van Bergen. We don't really hear any more about that. It once again just gets brushed under the carpet, which was obviously the point, but it was, you'd think there would be more about that. You'd think his body would show up or there'd be something more. The letter that was sent to them from the killer, we find out that he's been tracking all these main characters, but then no more about that whole concept. Just, it almost seemed as if they had too much going on to fit it all into one season. Would it have been better to finish off season 1 with the killing of Willem van Bergen? I think that might have been a good spot, and then have season 2 follow up with actually getting the killer himself. And that really probably just summarized my thoughts as well. I really enjoyed it, but I do recommend it as a historical period drama with crime and horror. But I almost feel as if it had too many powerful characters stealing the limelight, which isn't such a bad thing. It just made the show feel a little bit sluggish for story progression and a little bit muddled. But there was so many concepts, so many components with the show to think about, to talk about with other people. So all the crime itself, all the characters, what they're dealing with. So the sexism, the racism, the society issues around society, class and poverty, corruption and politics, corruption in the police, the gangsters, and all the characters and their skeletons in their closets. It really is a show thick with content. Once again, probably deserving of a second season with just the content from the season 1. I did also hear in an interview a few of the actors mentioned they're keen for season 2. So let's hope that happens. But for now, I shall leave this review here. I hope you enjoyed my review, my thoughts on it. Let me know your thoughts, put them in some comments below. And subscribe for future content around other Netflix shows and other shows coming out. Obviously, Westworld's a big one I'm covering, and Legion. So yeah, subscribe for that, leave me some feedback, and thumbs up if you like this video. And until next time, this is Mesh, and I'll see you later.